The electorate is so volatile at the moment. I could see a world in which the Tories are wiped out completely and replaced by Reform as the main term. I could also see a world where they get back in one term.
The big issues on the doorstep were infighting, sleaze, the appalling behaviour, I have to say, of some of my former colleagues. And actually immigration came up a lot.
But you'd have liked a much more centrist leader, wouldn't you?
I don't think that's right to say. I think Kemi's always had an originality.
Politically, she's fearless.
Fearless or foolhardy? Is she a Liz Truss?
No, I don't think so. I think Liz was obviously quite ideological, very forceful, and I think Kemi is probably a little bit more consultative.
What is Kemi Badenoch's path to power for the Conservatives? How does she deal, for example, with Nigel Farage? Hello and welcome to the Political Fourcast. Kemi Badenoch is the new leader of the Conservative Party after beating Robert Jenrick. It is an historic moment, the first black female leader of one of the UK's main political parties. But does she have any chance of winning the next election? Will she even hang on that long with the Tories' history of ditching leaders who don't deliver? With me, former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng, former Conservative MP Laura Farris, who lost her seat to the Liberal Democrats in July, and Luke Tryll of polling firm More in Common. Kemi Badenoch victorious, but Kwasi, are the Labour Party actually the real winners here?
Look, I think it's too early to say. I mean, I remember when Keir Starmer took over in beginning of 2020, and nobody thought he could possibly win the next election, but of course he did. There were events that meant that it was much easier for him to get into power than we anticipated. So let's just see. I think Kemi can grow. She's still an unknown quantity. So I think it's premature to say that the Labour Party is the real winner.
Well, Laura, you lost your seat to the Lib Dems. Kemi is well to the right of the party. Is she going to make it easier, if you stood again, to win back your kind of seat from the Lib Dems or not?
Well, I mean, there was a very strong anti-Conservative sentiment in my seat, as in pretty much every seat that the Conservatives lost. And if you look at the breakdown, Reform picked up about 11% of the vote, the Lib Dems went up by 7%, and the Greens actually went up by 3%. The only party that went backwards in my seat was Labour. Well, and me. But I think it's too binary to say, well, there people were saying I prefer a more left-leaning party, the Lib Dems. She's an authentic speaker. She's somebody that people don't know very well. And, the big issues on the doorstep were infighting, sleaze, the appalling behaviour, I have to say, of some of my former colleagues. And actually immigration came up a lot.
But you'd have liked a much more centrist leader, wouldn't you?
I don't think that's right to say. I think Kemi's always had an originality. And I also think actually the branding of her as a right-wing candidate is something I don't totally recognise. I think she's quite nuanced. I think she takes
nuanced?
Yep. I think she takes quite different positions on things. I think she's quite fearless. She's put this in her own speeches, but I do think some of the stuff she did on women's rights and the gender debate at an early stage, particularly when Scotland was trying to drive through that change in the law, not everybody was behind her. Labour were hitting us really hard on that, and she's absolutely right to say she won that argument. You don't hear it in the chamber of the House of Commons because now it's become an established principle that, women's safety and women's rights really matter. Kwasi, if you recognise that,
I think bits of her agenda will be right, but also lots of bits of her agenda are much more to the centre and the left of the party.
What's she done that's centrist?
So what she did, which was very strong, I thought, was she ruled out saying that she would leave the ECHR. Robert Jenrick was very clear about the European Court of Human Rights. He took a very kind of orthodox right-wing position on that. And Kemi deliberately said, I'm not going to go down that route.
But she hasn't said much on policy at all, so we don't really
You're
know.
right. I think she has done a bit of, I think it's called the Ming Vase strategy, which Labour did in 97 and again, I think this year, where they kept very quiet about the policies that they wanted to roll out. I think she's been very cautious. I think she's sort of fought the election really on personality, but now she'll have to be clearer about what her policies are.
I recognise that. And actually, I think you can see in some of what she said a variation of how Keir Starmer approached it with his changed Labour Party, which in a way was his headline point. She's talked about the fact we need to rebuild trust in the party, and unless you go back to values and principles and what the Conservative Party is all about, you don't get a hearing anyway. In a way, that is not a million miles away from his strategy.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably the only time Keir Starmer's been compared to Kemi Badenoch. But Luke, what do the voters say about, do they see her as very right-wing?
Well, I spent a lot of time over the summer, more time than I think anyone would want to, playing clips of all of the leadership candidates to focus groups. And the interesting thing about Kemi Badenoch is that when people see her talking, they will say, oh, she's refreshing. She seems different to a normal politician. I'd like to hear a bit more from her. And it was interesting. Although people thought in the hall that James Cleverly's conference speech was the better one, when we played clips to focus groups, they actually preferred Kemi Badenoch. So she definitely has something that can cut through to the public, which you want in Leader of the Opposition, because getting airtime in opposition is hard. The flip side, and I think this is the risk, and I think this is what she will have to avoid, is we also know the public are very tired of noisy politics. You know, we asked
But
this
she's
week,
the noisiest politician of all.
and so it's treading that line, isn't it, between being refreshing, being different, and being seen to cross the road to have a fight.
That's right. I mean, she's very, she can be quite combative. But we can't really forget the fact that this is a historic moment. I mean, she's a black woman leader of the Conservative Party. I mean, I happened to be in Nigeria, which is her country of origin, about a month ago. And they were telling me that they couldn't possibly believe that this would happen because, you know, Britain was far too racist, the Conservatives were far too racist and backward-looking and colonial-minded, and they just simply couldn't believe that Kemi Badenoch would be elected to this position.
What does it say about Britain, about the Conservative Party, that this has happened?
I think it's a remarkable thing, and I think we've got to acknowledge that. I don't think it's the be-all and end-all. We've had an Indian Prime Minister, we've had 3 female Prime Ministers, and actually it asks questions of the Labour Party. I mean, that is much more monolithic in the people that they decide to lead the party.
They've never even had a female leader.
No.
Laura?
And I think also it's interesting the way that Kemi identifies what makes her original. She doesn't really set much store about the fact that she's a black politician, but she is, to all intents and purposes, a first-generation immigrant, and she draws really heavily on her experience. I mean, all of her childhood, apart from the final, you know, when she was 16, 17, was spent in Lagos. And there's a huge amount that she draws from that, and why we should have pride in our nation and be, you know, grateful for the kind of the norms and the values that she says actually a lot of people take for granted.
I think that's
a
a very, very pertinent point, because a lot of the other politicians from other, you know, backgrounds outside of Europe, like myself or Rishi or others, were born in this country, most of us, and we grew up in this country. But what Laura said about Kemi's experience in Nigeria, I think is really pertinent.
But, you know, we've seen in the US how some men can't bring themselves to vote for Kamala Harris because she's a woman of colour. Do you think Kemi Badenoch might face the same challenges at the ballot box?
I think there'll always be a few people for whom that is very important. But whether it's enough really to define her candidature or to prevent her from getting into number 10. I don't think that's true. I mean, even in the 70s, there were people who did not vote for Margaret Thatcher because she was a woman.
Yeah,
they just
and I think that's still...
I've met them. I've met some of them.
I still think there'd be some men who would resist a female leader of any party, and I think there are people who don't like a multi-racial society, but it is here to stay, and I think the
I don't think it'll affect the results.
You faced this in your political career.
No, I mean, I faced it once in my constituency when I ran for the first time, and we knocked on about 200 doors. We got the typical, whatever it was, 50% that we were going to get in the election. And one person out of the 200 made a point about my ethnicity. So that was 0.5%. Now, I don't know whether that's representative of the entire constituency, but it's not going to be more than maybe 1.5% probably.
So how did you deal with that?
I think I just talked to him and said, look, this is completely, you know, you're wrong. I share many of your values. I don't know who he voted for ultimately.
How do you think Kemi Badenoch would deal with a similar...
I think she'd be very straightforward and very frank. And that's one of her charms, if you like. That's one of her strengths, is that she's willing to engage with difficult issues.
Yeah, I mean, we are a world away from the US in terms of our electoral dynamics here. I mean, during the riots, we asked about people's attitudes to multi-ethnic Britain, and it was around 6-7% of the country who say that they're ashamed or uncomfortable with the idea of multi-ethnic Britain. So it is a very small chunk. And when
but a very vocal minority, when you look at what did happen in the riots.
A very vocal, and they can make a lot of noise, but I think that noise and, you know, sometimes violence can give an outsized impression of how big that group were. And obviously, you know, we ran focus groups right through the election, and people had many criticisms of Rishi Sunak, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
I don't think once his race or background came up in those discussions that we have. I think lots of British people are quite relaxed. They don't want to they often don't make a big song and dance about these things. It's just a sort of British way of, it is what it is, and we accept people here. So I don't think we're like the US in that regard.
So look, I think to say that that won't be a factor, I think is wrong. I think there will be voters for whom her ethnicity or even her gender actually will be a problem. But I don't think that will be enough of an issue to stop her from getting to the ultimate.
How has she neutralised that problem?
I don't think it's something that she has to really neutralise. I think for a lot of these people, and they are a very small minority, as Luke says, there's not much she will be able to do about that. She can't change her ethnicity, she can't change her gender. What she has to do is talk to the 93% of people who are comfortable with a multi-ethnic society and convince them to vote for the Conservatives. That's the real issue.
So Laura, speaking from your own experience of failing to win that seat, you fought incredibly hard, I know. What is Kemi Badenoch's path to power for the Conservatives? How does she deal, for example, with Nigel Farage?
Well, first of all, I think her biggest challenge is actually uniting the party. And if you look at the final round of the parliamentary voting between her, James Cleverly and Rob Jenrick, it really kind of split three ways. And if you look at the vote today, 72% of members voted, which means 28% didn't. That's quite a lot to have actually sat on their hands at such a kind of pivotal moment, I would say.
It's just they didn't think much of either candidate.
It's hard to know. I mean, I think probably, to be honest, some of our members might have voted Reform
Right.
and felt a bit guilty about then kind of poking their nose into the next stage because they're not sure where they are. But anyway, I think that is probably her biggest challenge. One of the things I think that she has as a politician, and I think you could see it. You see it as a strength or a weakness, but it's the same thing. She has an authenticity about the way she speaks, and the fact that she is an eye-catching politician. I think Luke has alluded to this from what he's seen in his focus groups. It's going to be quite inspiring to quite a lot of people just to see her there, just the fact of her leadership.
But some of those members who didn't vote might have just preferred James Cleverly, who they might have thought would bring the party together better.
I don't know.
Like you.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I wasn't, in any camp, and I just watched the candidates really carefully, and I agree. I think she also made a really good conference speech. I thought that was quite a big moment for her, and I thought also one or two of her most recent hustings have been really, really powerful. And my members who went to attend things went with an open mind, but came out in favour of her. So I'm seeing her sort of shape opinion. And one of the things she also has, which is a little rarer than it should be in politics, she's quite mischievous, and she's got quite a good sense of humour. And Boris had that very famously, but she has it in a different way.
There's an authenticity.
She can be naughty at the dispatch box in a way. Actually, Tony Blair could be mischievous in the same way. When you see the way he used to toy with Cameron or William Hague, he didn't necessarily always come off on top of that exchange, but he would use humour as a device, and she uses it too.
The point that Laura made about the numbers is really, really pertinent. And I remember this from when Liz Truss won. It was almost exactly the same. So we had a three-way split with Rishi Sunak, who was ahead, and then Liz narrowly beat Penny Mordaunt into the last two.
Yeah.
And then, irony of ironies, the split was something like 43%, which is pretty much nailed on to where we are today.
Yeah.
So it's almost exactly the same situation. And I think where Liz probably went slightly wrong was we should have reached out to the other people in the party, the people who backed other candidates. I remember Grant Shapps was sacked, and I remember thinking that was a very odd move, because he was very good at the media. He represented a different wing of the party.
And he could do the numbers behind the scenes.
Exactly. And I think he was, I know Grant, he's a good friend, but he was not exactly on message during that conference where things started to go wrong very badly, and before that.
So Kemi Badenoch needs to basically potentially tack to the centre in terms of what she's saying, how she's handling herself with
I wouldn't put it in those crude policy terms. I think she needs a broad tent, and she needs to reach out to all wings of the party.
I think that if you look across her key backers, she had bought a blend of the party, probably more than Rob had. I think it would be fair to say that.
That's right.
Broad tent, but it's a tiny tent. That's the problem.
Well, it's a small tent now, but we all have small tents. The Labour government got 33% out of a 60% turnout. So, certainly the two major political parties have an issue trying to get
Labour's
broad.
got hundreds of MPs
They
to
do,
choose
they
from.
do, they do.
Just selecting a front bench is going to be incredibly challenging.
Even if you look, you're right. And if you look at it's 121 MPs, even that small number has a range of people with lots of different ideas. You've got people like Christopher Chope, who've been around forever, who is, under no circumstances a lefty. I mean, he's very much on the right of the party. And then you've got people, like James Cleverly himself, who's now
who
been on a
won't
journey.
serve on her front bench.
No, and I can understand why he wouldn't do that, because
It's a bit of a vote of no confidence.
Well, I don't think so. I think he's, his wife has had a tough time health-wise, and he's talked about that publicly. His kids are, in their sort of young adult age, they probably want parental support. He's been at this for years.
Yeah, but maybe he just knows she's not going to stick
No,
with the
I think
post.
you always, in the media, want to put the worst possible interpretation on things.
Right,
Actually,
Jeremy
I can
Hunt's not
see-
serving either. I mean,
I can see
it's
a
not a
world.
ringing endorsement, is it?
No, but I mean, I can also see there are lots of other factors in James's life, which means that at this stage, he probably wants to take some time on the back benches.
Luke, how does she handle this divided party and try and create a team that looks like a winning team?
I actually think that's the key question, because when we asked the public, do you think the Conservatives should pivot to the left? 20% said they should. Pivot to the right, 22% said they should. Most people said neither. The reason the Conservatives lost wasn't an issue of ideology. In fact, if you ask people to describe the Conservatives in one word, the word that jumps out is chaotic. That's the number one. So the team that she builds not only has to be a broad church, but it's got to convince people that the days of the Tory party having their internal dramas are over, needs to stop. That is the big challenge.
I mean, I was part of that. I mean, I lived through all of that, those 5 years from 2017 where we messed up the election.
You're the face of chaos.
Well, I mean, I lived it. I was part of it. And I think you're absolutely right. I think the whole psychodrama, the kind of crazy policy shifts, the reshuffles, the sackings, the letters, the leaders.
It's
being
competence,
decapitated.
not ideology.
All of that stuff.
Yeah, but
needs to
she's
stop.
ideological, and she has this reputation of crossing the street to start a fight, starting a fight in an empty room.
Yeah, I'm more worried about the starting a fight in an empty room.
And you
bit.
said earlier she was combative. Have you had that experience yourself?
No, I mean, she's a friend of mine, and she's got a wonderful family. Her husband's a friend of mine. She's a really, really good person. I think politically, she's fearless. She will say, actually, I don't agree with what you're saying, and that's nonsense.
Fearless or foolhardy? Is she a Liz Truss?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think Liz was obviously quite ideological, very forceful, and I think Kemi is probably a little bit more consultative. I think she'll be a team player.
You stood against Kemi in the selection, when she was first elected as a Tory MP. Did you see this combative woman or not?
That was actually the start of our friendship, because we were in the final three for Saffron Walden, and actually there was another person who I think was the favourite. And so Kemi and I were these two kind of random mums who were just sort of sitting in the corner of the room waiting to go in, and then she won it. And actually the next morning, I opened my phone and I had a message from her. I hadn't even given her my number, actually. So she'd found it out from someone, and she said, I just wanted to let you know that I really enjoyed meeting you, and I know how depressing that bus ride in the rain home is when you haven't won a selection, because I've done it multiple times. And don't be disheartened, keep going. And afterwards, actually, we went for a drink in the pub, and she gave me some advice on how she thought she'd finally got herself selected, because it took her a few goes. And I was always really touched she did that, because I think for a lot of people, the moment they're selected for a seat, they're really happy and they're carried away in their own success. And she took time to look somebody up. And empathetic and really supportive.
And sisterly.
Yeah, and she has actually, just on that note, she has deep friendships in the party, across the party. I would say, I have to be honest, I think particularly with some of the women, and I think she is seen as someone who has been very supportive of us.
Luke, we don't know a lot about Kemi Badenoch personally, as your polls have shown. How do you think people would warm to her? What does she need to show voters in these crucial sort of first 100 days?
I think the first thing is showing that she can run a steady ship. It's very boring, but she needs to be the antithesis of what came before. And then she needs to find the way, and this is almost sounding like a sort of impossible task, of catching the public's attention. So keeping up that stuff that people like about her, but without looking like it's going to be more of the same in terms of the drama, in terms of the rows. Kemi in the conference speech, yes. Kemi in some of those arguments with journalists, no. Because if every Sunday is a Twitter fight with a journalist, you're onto a hiding for nothing.
She needs to stop the Twitter, or be very,
Get
very,
off Twitter.
Give it to someone else.
or give it to somebody else to run and curate.
Okay.
But otherwise, I think actually her engagement with the issues, her candour, her frankness, I think all those things are good.
And what does your polling show about how she should tackle the Nigel Farage issue?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting challenge. Obviously, the Conservatives lost a lot of votes to reform. There is no path back for the Conservatives without winning back some reform votes. But the really interesting thing is if you look at the voters who say they're most likely to go back to the Tories within one term, it's actually those that switch to Labour. And those that switch to the Liberal Democrats. And so if you look at the polling, one approach might be to say, win back some of those Labour switchers, win back some of the Lib Dem switchers, and some of those Tories who stayed at home. They're a big chunk and really important. And then
that might be enough.
you pitch to reform voters, it's now a straight choice. You make the Conservatives look competitive again. And the one thing we know about reform voters is they might not like the Tories. They dislike Labour even more. But last time, it didn't matter because Labour were going to win.
That's
it's a phase. It's not either or. It's about the phasing that you go for.
But he's quite right. If the Conservatives are competitive and look like they might win or have a chance of winning, a lot of that reform vote will come and vote Conservative. The reason they didn't was that they knew we were going to be smashed and they felt that they could vote reform with no consequence.
We've had the Labour budget this week.
Yeah.
A lot of Tories were sort of buoyed up potentially by, they're back in the game, they think.
Well, I think it's premature, as I say, but I mean, this was a very, and I've written about this, it was a very left-leaning budget. I mean, you talked about Kemi going to the right. I mean, this was all tax rises, and tax rises specifically on wealth creation, on capital,
So you tried a different approach with your mini budget.
Yeah, and it was too fast.
And you admit
too much. I totally admit that. I admit that. What I do admit is that we should have proceeded with more caution, and more rigor, and a bit more slowly.
But after this week's budget, is there an opportunity for Kemi Badenoch to do something more radical, but in greater time?
Yeah. So I mean, one of the big differences, of course, is that she's only leader of the opposition. She's not prime minister. She doesn't have to run the government from day one, and I think that gives her time to really come up with an economic offer.
But a radical economic
offer?
Well,
it'll be very different from this government, so I'm sure of that. But it'll be staged. Well, I'm sure she'll want to reduce taxes, and I'm sure she'll have words on how we can improve public service delivery. I don't know what the details will be.
How does that sound to you, Laura?
I agree with that, but I would also say I think one of the things that I've always found quite impressive in certain leaders of the opposition is when they are willing to give a government credit for things they're doing well. And then I think that when they oppose, they have more force and credibility because they've already demonstrated that they're not just there to nitpick every single point and hammer them.
So she should give the government credit for some of the things they did in the budget?
I think all forms of opposition involve you can demonstrate that you have good judgment by saying we accept that you had to make this choice, and then going. And actually some of the time when I was an MP, that I thought became a bit of a weakness in Labour, I know that they won the election, is that they would just hammer every single point.
Can she give the government much credit on the budget, or should she be much more robust?
So look, the budget, I think I would be more robust against that. I can't see how she can go in as leader of the opposition once they raise taxes by 40 billion in one budget and say we should do more of that.
But on taxes, you think the time might be right to have another go at a sort of tax-cutting agenda?
Look, so what we tried to do that was completely wrong was do everything at once. And looking back, that was a mistake. You've got to salami slice things. What she has now is 4 years in opposition in which she can formulate a plan and a strategy and a path to whatever vision of society in Britain she has.
But that should be a much lower tax.
Well, I don't see it could be more. You can tax more if that's the question you're asking.
She puts it a different.
What's the appetite?
Well, there is a danger that the Tories fall into a trap that Labour has set, which is the workers versus big business in opposing budget. They will have to tread very carefully. Because it's fair to say, look, the public weren't overwhelmed with the budget, but it also wasn't as bad as they feared. And I think the danger is in that framing. Labour have, for right or wrong, set out a marker about who they stand for. And if the Conservatives end up on the wrong side of that, I think that could be really dangerous for them.
Okay.
But I think that she has already set out the contours of what she thinks about government, because she said repeatedly, actually, government should do fewer things well.
She said that.
And she is going to have to expand on that and explain what that means. Right. And I think that is
a smaller state, in other words.
Yes, but she'll obviously have to say what that means. That is a principle I think that quite a lot of voters are quite interested in.
If in 2 or 3 years' time we haven't got the growth that we need, the government will have to come back and probably raise taxes. Everyone can see that. And it's at that point where the greatest risk is for the government. We're in year one, they've got this budget, we'll have to see what the outcome of it is. But the danger for them is if they don't get the growth, then they come back for more taxes. It won't just be the corporations and people with farms that will be taxed. At some point, working people as they define them will also be taxed more, and that's where the risk is.
At that point, there's a chance, isn't there, to get through some of the agenda that you wanted to get through in your mini budget, but you accept you did too hastily.
So look, I think it'll come back. I think that a lower tax take will come back as an issue. And you've got to remember why we are where we are. It was COVID that massively increased spending, and as a consequence of spending hundreds of billions in a year, we never used to do that, by the way. In a year, we spent £300 billion supporting the economy. And that's why taxes structurally are very high now. And we had to deal with it, and Rachel Reeves has to deal with it too.
Luke's grimacing.
But look, I mean, and no offence to Kwasi in the budget, it would have to be badged in a very different way.
Of course it would, I've accepted that a million times. To do everything in one budget, in one statement, was wrong.
But but the risk of Labour linking it to that budget, because we know that, that was the one point when the polls severely turned against the Tories, and they need to regain that sense of economic credibility. But I do think you're right. I mean, it's interesting. We're sat here talking about what does Kemi need to do. The truth is her electoral prospects will largely be determined by does Labour fix the NHS and does it reduce the cost of living. If it doesn't, Kemi will be Prime Minister. If it does, she won't.
Right.
Is she going to be leader stroke Prime Minister at the next election?
I think so. I think she'll be leader at the next election.
I do too, yeah.
Leader at the next election, but won't become Prime Minister?
Well, let's see.
I agree with Luke. I think a lot of it is going to depend on what happens
100%.
with Labour, but I think she will lead the party into the next election. I feel confident in that.
So what happened, and you look, the last time we had a first leader, female leader, 1975, the first time we had that. For most of that parliament, Labour were expected to win the election. It was only at the end, with the winter of discontent and all the strikes, and the fact that it looked as if Britain wasn't working.
You think she could be another Thatcher?
Well, Thatcher only,
that sort of
but only Thatcher only became Thatcher because of what happened to the Labour government.
I also think we need to stop talking about Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah, I agree.
I really do. I think it's like I'm
bored of
so
that.
sick of
I've written a book about her. No, I'm done. I don't know why we're doing
but
that.
Kemi Badenoch quite likes talking about Margaret Thatcher.
Well, look, I mean, I was just trying to draw the analogy to the fact that for most of that parliament, it looked as if Labour were going to win. And it was only at the end that Thatcher won.
Luke, they both think she'll be leader at the next election, possibly Prime Minister. What's the electoral reality from your figures?
Well, on past history, it will be very difficult to overturn that size of majority in one term. But the difference is the electorate is so volatile at the moment. I could see a world in which the Tories are wiped out completely and replaced by Reform as the main server. I could also see a world where they get back in one term. That we're in really uncharted territory in electoral dynamics at the moment. I don't think people are quite appreciating that yet.
Luke Tryll, Laura Farris, Kwasi Kwarteng, thank you all very much. That is it for this edition of the Political Forecast for now. Goodbye.